Hello friends, for today's video I want to do a tier ranking of over 30 different epic fantasy works. As I go through this tier ranking, I am going to be ranking individual entries within series as opposed to grouping them together and ranking the series in its entirety, as I do find that individual entries often inform how I feel about the entirety of a series, and I think that it's fun to kind of dissect and look at those and allow for the vehicle of a tier ranking to have a jumping off point for conversation. Before I jump into it, I do have a question to kind of keep in mind as we go through this tier ranking, which is, what is the book that as I rank it, you are the most in alignment with me on? And then what is the book that you are completely in opposition to? Because I think tier rankings really illuminate just how much our tastes can align and vary, and I would love to know what your responses are to that. I can already guess that some of what I've put in the middle tiers are going to fit this for you, but I wonder if it's the top and bottom tiers that are actually going to elicit the most strong reactions. The middle tiers, 3 and 4, are ones where more than likely books within these I am open to checking out other books in the series, especially because with epic fantasy, it needs time to establish itself, build its foundation. So I'm usually willing, even if something would fall in the 4th tier, I'm willing to keep going at least for one more entry to see if maybe it's okay, I just had to get acclimated and now that I'm in it, I'm more invested, or if it's just it's not you, it's me situation. Tier 3 I am certainly going to continue on, but also I have a little bit more positive association. The way I've categorized this in the past is that if I own a physical copy, probably going to keep it. Tier 4, if I owned a physical copy, more likely going to take it in, but no hard feelings. And then for tier 2, these are books that I really enjoyed. They do stand out. I think of them really favorably, but they maybe aren't all-time favorites. Tier 5, these are definitely books that didn't work for me. Maybe they frustrated me at times. Maybe I wanted a little bit more from them in certain areas. There aren't going to be too many in tier 6, but there are a couple, and we will get to those. And those ones, depending on the tier ranking video, sometimes tier 6, I'm just kind of like, these didn't work for me at all. And sometimes I'm like, I cannot stand these, and I have very strong feelings about them. So tier 6 is that today for me. Tier 1, these books are fantastic. Absolutely love these. I think that they're standouts within the genre. I can't get enough. I'm probably not going to shut up about them, so that's where they go. As always, I like doing my tier rankings by starting in the middle and working our way out, so that's what we're going to do today. And tier 3, there are quite a lot of entries in tier 3. So we're going to start with, let's go ahead and start with The Grace of Kings, as this is one of the only ones on the list today that I have yet to continue on with the series. And I have heard a lot of people say they feel like the first entry is actually the weakest one in the series, and it gets better and better as it goes. So currently, as I described for this tier, this is very much something that I plan to continue on with. I liked it. I liked aspects of it quite a bit. I think the feeling of short story writing is captured, even though this is a long book just by itself. I do feel like that feeling is represented really well within that first entry. I also really like the setting. I like the more silk punk components and simultaneously combining a lot of what feels like real history alongside fantasy pieces. I think that's really cool. That said, I do think that this has a little bit of a bird's eye view at times, which makes sense for epic fantasy, but I do find that I tend to favor epic fantasy that even though the stakes are really big, you have a lot of perspectives, I still like it when we feel close to the characters and we utilize more close third-person perspective. We don't do that as often in this. We have almost this feeling of it being omniscient, which isn't necessarily an objective bad thing. It's just something that's not typically what's going to make an epic fantasy stand out for me. So while I like it, this is why it's more so in the middle. I should just say, even though I talked about how I'm going to be tier ranking different entries of individual series, the first 4 books in Wheel of Time, I'm putting them all in this 3rd tier. And typically, if something is in this tier, it means I will continue on with the series. However, I gave Wheel of Time 4 books, and everybody always says the 4th book is when you know, oh, this series is amazing. And the 4th book was when I was like, I mean, it's fine. I don't really have strong feelings. The characters irritate me pretty often. I do like the writing. I do like the way that the magic is set up, and I do actually think it was kind of ahead of its time in comparison to some of its peers. So there are a lot of things to compliment about Wheel of Time, and I feel like even fans of Wheel of Time kind of have a love-hate relationship with it, and the parts that the fandom hates are the parts that also, I would say, kind of irritate me, and as such, I just never continued on. I will say, though, something that the epic fantasy works that don't work for me have made me realize is that I am more likely to continue with Wheel of Time than, well, this is hard to explain because I am continuing on with some of the ones I don't like, but I would rather read the rest of the 10 books. I'd rather reread those first 4 books in Wheel of Time and then continue and read the rest of the series than reread some of the ones that I don't like as much, even though they're only trilogies. So Wheel of Time I have just kind of middle of the road feelings where I don't hate the series. I don't love it though. And that's why it's just kind of like, well, yeah, it's fine. I also put in this category, it's the only one from Stormlight Archive in this category, but I put Oathbringer. And Oathbringer seems to always be such a, you never know. It's kind of the wild card book of that series because a lot of people really like the first 2. Rhythm of War is pretty hit or miss. To me, it truly feels like hit or miss. Either people think it's one of the best in the series or they really didn't like it. Oathbringer, though, it's like that as well, where it could be this is one of the best in the series, or I don't like this at all, or it's just kind of middle of the road. I don't have strong feelings. It feels like middle book. It just kind of has people feeling all kinds of different ways about it. And I am one of the people that until Wind and Truth came out, Oathbringer was my least favorite in the series. That kind of spoils you for where Wind and Truth is going to go. But Oathbringer, to me, is just not as strong in almost every way as, in my opinion, at that point, the previous 2 that had come out. I think that there are interesting things happening, and then we have a tendency in that book to spend a lot of time on the things I don't find as interesting. So it had a little bit of a slower pace as a result. And I do also think that the Sanderlanche felt quite similar in how it was laid out to the previous 2, but I didn't have quite the same emotional connection to all the pieces. There's certainly one piece that you have a lot of connection to, but then some of the other ones are ones that are incorporating more of like the interlude characters and things like that. Whereas the first 2, the Sanderlanches in the first 2, you have such investment in, so it just didn't quite hit on the same level. Also, when I was rereading the series, it was the one that I enjoyed the least as I was preparing for Wind and Truth. It just doesn't quite hit for me in the same ways. None of the things I'm talking about today I'm going to go super, super in-depth with because we are kind of doing overview to tier ranking. But if I have more in-depth thoughts, I will have all of that linked. And Oathbringer and pretty much all the Stormlight Archive books, I've done in-depth discussions with other booktubers for all of these. So I'll have those linked if you're interested. Next up, we have Assassin's Apprentice. I hesitated on including the Farseer books in this just because I kind of see it more as Realm of the Elderlings is epic fantasy. And I think if you consider all of the Fitz books together, that does result in something very epic, especially in the sense that not only does it exist within an epic fantasy world, but also it is kind of a different approach to follow a character for so much of their life. However, I read the first 2 in this series, and then I ended up DNFing the 3rd one. I'm not going to tier rank the 3rd one today, but Assassin's Apprentice, I liked it well enough. I wasn't completely enamored with it. It did end up being my favorite in the trilogy, but even though I really like the idea of exploring characters, I even talked about it in relation to Grace of Kings. I really like that kind of close character examination. I really liked it, especially in Assassin's Apprentice. I just didn't find that the way the rest of the story was executed was quite enough for this to be anything more than this particular tier. Also, I have Arrow's Flight and Arrow's Fall in this. If you don't know, this is part of one of the series within Mercedes Lackey's Valdemar. And I really, really, really enjoyed the first book, and I just felt like the second and the third weren't quite reaching the same levels as the first, but I still enjoy the trilogy overall, so that's why the second and third are here in this spot. We also have Fury of the Gods. I did really, really like the first 2 in this series, and I still like the third one. The third one just kind of feels like one giant boss rush, which I'm not opposed to. I do think that maybe feels more satisfying if you read the trilogy back to back. In fact, I've recommended in the past in talking about this series to, if you're going to jump into it, try to set aside time to read all 3 together, because that last book is really truly, I was just talking about the Sanderlanches and Stormlight Archive. It's like that, but mostly just contained to one book. But it did mean that one book was a lot of action. And I liked in the first 2 books when we balanced out the action and the character moments a little bit more. I understand why it's there, because it's really like this big climactic moment. And sometimes in series it can work for me, but in this one I think it brought it just back a little bit in comparison to the other 2. Still really like it though, of course. I really quite like that series. And then the last one for this category would be Mad Ship. This is within the Live Ship Traders by Robin Hobb. And this one had a little bit of middle book syndrome for me. The first book was such a standout and I loved it so much. So I think in comparison, it highlighted for me how much I thought this one was just pretty good, but it wasn't quite as enjoyable for me as what we're going to talk about in my second tier. And there were aspects to it that I thought the pacing was kind of funny. Who we chose to spend time with in comparison to who we didn't was not really to my liking as much. I just thought it was a little bit uneven, and I was so thoroughly engrossed in the first one that I think in comparison, I was just kind of like, some of these characters, I wish we could just go back. And I know that's a really common thing for a lot of epic fantasy, when you have a lot of perspectives, when you go to certain characters and you're like, I don't want to be with this one. I just want to go back to this other one. I find them way more interesting. And that was definitely true for a Mad Ship for me. When it comes to the 4th tier, these are the ones, to reiterate, that if I pick up a book in one of the series, then I will try another one. But if there's 2 within this tier, then that's probably a pretty good indication that's not for me. It's kind of like you take that concept I described with Wheel of Time and you cut it in half, and that's true for whatever's in this. And then also one other that's a little different. So there's not too many in 4th tier, but the 2, and this is where I feel like there's going to be the biggest discrepancies in our feelings. But the first 2 to mention in this tier would be Gardens of the Moon and Dead House Gates. I really appreciate the scope of Malazan, and I appreciate the thematic elements that really resonate with a lot of people. How they were executed, however, did not result in it resonating with me. I recognize, of course, that part of it is that you have to get to further entries of the works, but something about how the characters are written, I think something similar to what I described with Grace of Kings. There's almost a sense of this omniscient narrator to some degree. I think that results in me feeling kind of detached. One thing that is more of a con for me, not an objective flaw, but it's just something that I don't love, which is the way in which Steven Erikson, the way I would word it is that he purposefully withholds information from you. The way that the fandom tends to word it is that he doesn't hold your hand. I think there's a difference. I think not holding your hand is where you don't necessarily give info dumps. You only allow for readers to discover what's happening through following characters and picking up on context clues. That to me is not holding somebody's hand. But purposefully withholding information is when you have an entire scene where you don't say a character's name, and then later you do say a character's name. And to me that's a little coy. I don't know if I consider that not holding your hand so much. I think that's just being sneaky, but not in a way that I find as interesting or captivating. I have compared it in the past to Souls games, which I really like Souls games a lot. I was such a hater on Elden Ring at first, and I'm like, never mind, this is great. But I love Elden Ring, and then of course we have so many Souls-like games. So for example, Lies of P, I love Lies of P, I think it's great. And these are games that I'll play, I will replay them, probably too much. But I have the feeling of fun that comes with the actual playing of a game. The lore, for me, I'm not like, oh my gosh, I feel so emotional over this lore in the story. When it's like, if I have to read item descriptions to get the lore, and then I gotta try to piece together. That's kind of what Malazan feels like, except for I don't have the plus of playing a really fun game. I think that Malazan could be used as source material to create lore for a Souls-like game. That would be awesome. But in novel form, just doesn't quite work for me. Then the only other one in this tier is Wind and Truth. I know I'm not alone. I mean, I know a lot of people felt kind of not as thrilled with Wind and Truth, and I was one of those people, and I sat on it for a long time because I kept thinking, maybe it's the expectations I placed on this. Maybe I thought it was going to be more of a conclusion than it was, and instead it's more like a stepping stone into something new. And I do feel like there's a tonal shift to some degree, and I don't think that the character work was what it could have been. I think the pacing was a little funny. I just don't have a lot of positive things to say about Wind and Truth. It didn't upset me necessarily. It didn't make me angry. I think I was just... I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed. Let's stay in the negative for a little bit. Royal Assassin. I could not stand Fitz in Royal Assassin, and he's our main character. He's the person we follow the whole book, and I couldn't stand him, and as such, I didn't like this book. I tried. I picked up the third one, and then, as I said, I ended up DNFing it pretty quickly. I was like, I know people love Fitz, and I know people... I have a lot of patience for real humans and real children. I have no patience for what I feel is almost a caricature of young people's experiences that we get in fantasy of this era. I don't know what it is. I don't know what was in the air where apparently every kid was just like a snotty-nosed brat or something, but I do not like the way that they're executed. I don't like the way they're portrayed. There are ways to write characters that are young and sometimes irritating. Sometimes you wish that you could just be like, come on, get it together. I think there are ways to write those kinds of characters where you feel for them. And instead, I was just so irritated with Fitz in this. It just put me off from the rest of the series. As I said, I tried the third one, and I was like, I just can't. And there's always more interesting things happening around him than actually with him. And I do want to clarify, I am so appreciative of the author taking the time to have a deep character analysis, especially in relation to the feeling of helplessness and that in combination with depression. I really appreciate that. However, I still find the rest of things to do with Fitz irritating, especially in Royal Assassin, how he treats Molly. The only other one in this 5th tier is the Dragonbone chair. I probably don't need to say too much because I did a whole video talking about how much Simon irritated me. A lot of what I said about Fitz, just turn that up to full volume because that's how I feel about Simon. Among other things, the Dragonbone chair for me is just not paced as well as I would like. I also did a wrap-up where I go a little bit more in depth about my thoughts about the first 2 books in this series, and they just have not quite worked for me. And I've talked about them very recently, so I'm not going to go in depth right now. About some positive things. So, Heirs of the Queen. I mentioned that this series by Mercedes Lackey, that the first one was my favorite in the trilogy, and I did quite like it. I thought it was very wholesome. And a great example of a character who is experiencing a lot of things that I think young people can really connect with, or that we as adults can relate to if we experience something similar, because the young girl in the story was abused by her caretakers. And so seeing how she's trying to get through that and how she's learning to trust other people, I really appreciate. And there's this lovely, lovely relationship between her and this elderly man, and it's so wholesome and so cute. And it's just so nice to see not only their dynamic, but just getting to see a young person like allowing themselves to be cared about and cared for. And then they also are starting to trust some other people, especially adults. They're not seeing them all as these basically abusers, and it's done really well. And also, Heirs of the Queen came out before the Dragonbone chair and before Royal Assassin, because I know sometimes people are like, well, it was the time it was written, and I'm always like, kinda. I mean, I get it, but also Heirs of the Queen. It was really, it's a perfect illustration of a young person's experience without them just being insufferable and annoying, and actually showcasing really raw realities for a lot of young people, but also being able to see wonderful and beautiful things too through all of that. And she does go through a lot as she ages, which we see in the 2nd and 3rd books. But the portrayal of all of what I was just describing, I think, is really, really great. Green Rider, like Grace of Kings, this is one of the only ones on the list that there are multiple entries, and I've thus far only read the first, but I really liked the first because it had a lot of that classic heroic quest fantasy feel to it. And especially, you know, you're going from point A to point B. At the end of the day, it's probably going to be kind of good guy and bad guy, or good and evil, that sort of feeling. It's got a lot of the ingredients that we see in a lot of epic fantasy, but it just feels a little bit more nostalgic in a sense, not that the other, I mean, that maybe isn't the best word because the other ones feel nostalgic for a lot of people. They're tapping into a similar thing, but there's something about this one that has this vibrance to it that I really, really just loved sitting in this world. I just felt like the world felt so much more alive. And the way that things were described and the feelings of the characters and everything, I just feel like it was a little bit above what sometimes some of the ones I don't connect with as much. This one I thought delivered in a way I like, but I don't see Green Rider talked about as often, and I can't quite figure out why that is. I really quite enjoyed it. Then we have Shadow of the Gods and Hunger of the Gods. I already kind of talked about how I really, really liked the balance between the really cool, epic feel of this series alongside character development. And definitely the first two had that balance really, really wonderfully. For me, I also just really like how John Gwynne captured this setting. And he did have some perspectives from these sniveling, awful characters also alongside your heroes. This is more so in Hunger of the Gods than Shadow of the Gods. But I liked that expansion. And I also liked the moral grayness of pretty much all of your characters. I really enjoyed that across these two. After that, we have Rise of the Ranger and Empire of Dirt. These are more modern fantasy works, more modern epic fantasy works, but that have a lot of the makings of what we enjoy in epic fantasy. It has this really huge world. It's got a lot of the classic fantasy races, and also those races, we're not necessarily doing the most unique and new things with them, but it just feels like we're combining them in ways where the story itself is unique and how these characters interact with each other and how they come to go on this quest together, or they're coming together for a certain reason, a certain cause, how those things all transpire. That's the fun of the story, whereas the background, the backdrop, is kind of the part that feels familiar. So we're using a familiar framework to tell a really captivating and adventurous epic fantasy. And I am having such a good time with the series. I really need to keep going because I had plans to pick up way more entries than what we have so far, and I haven't yet. Engines of Empire and Engines of Chaos. These I considered putting the top because I really, really do love these. They are newer epic fantasy, and they're the only ones I think on this entire list, aside from maybe aspects of Grace of Kings, but I think this is truer of this series, where it is epic fantasy with steampunk, and it's so fun. It's so fun. You follow this particular family who is a part of this guild, and each of the members of this family have their own perspectives. They are not the most likable of people, and for various different reasons. Sometimes they're hot-headed, or sometimes they're a little dense, or sometimes they're a little too ambitious or arrogant. But you kind of get sucked into this family and all of the ways in which they're trying to attain power, how they're trying to maintain their control on their guild and also their guild's place within society. But then on top of all of that, you're seeing the ways that there's almost like this uprising that's occurring with the general population because of the ways in which the guilds have taken advantage of them and profited for themselves, and there's like this wealth disparity. And then you have certain kinds of magic users and also religion that is trying to fulfill the needs of the population, but they in their own ways are just also villainous in nature. And you're kind of seeing all these things come to a head, and it's so fun. I have started the third one. I just haven't finished it yet. Otherwise, I would be talking about that one too. But I just have a lot of fun with this. And if you're a fan of audiobooks, we have different narrators for all the different perspectives, and they all do, I think, a very good job. Ascendant. This is the classic A Boy and His Dragon sort of story, and I really, really like how it is executed. I also really enjoy the second one, so technically the second one is in this category as well. It's not quite as... I liked the first one a little bit more, but they're both within this category, and I need to read the third one, just like what I was saying with Rise of the Ranger in that series. I had meant to read more in this series and just haven't had a chance yet, and the fourth one's out now, and I really need to pick up the third one and then just jump into the fourth. But truly, truly, if you like the classic A Boy and His Dragon kind of epic fantasy, this is the series for you. And now for the top tier and the bottom tier. I think I'll start with the bottom. One of them is Ship of Destiny. One is at the top, one is in the middle, and one is at the bottom. So I'm kind of spoiling that Ship of Magic is at the top because I loved it so much. Ship of Destiny is at the bottom because I despised it. I didn't despise it in its entirety. I mostly despised the last quarter, I would say. How things wrapped up and how certain things were shown to us, I couldn't stand. I couldn't stand it. And it's so frustrating because I loved the first book. Besides just really being quite upset about how some things were handled, I also just really didn't like how things wrapped up and resolved. I thought it was very unfulfilling. It felt like we didn't do as much as I would have wanted with some of these characters, and I was just let down. I really thought after Ship of Magic, even though Assassin's Apprentice, Royal Assassin were really working for me, after that, Ship of Magic, I loved so much that I'm like, I'm all in. I'm going to read all the Realm of the Elderlings because Ship of Magic is so good. And then within 2 books, I was like, never mind. And I left just angry at it. I really want to emphasize again, I'm not saying objectively that this is a truth, that this is a problem or anything like that. I just personally do not like how things are handled in certain scenarios. And I also just don't know that I think that some of the character work that a lot of people resonate with and connect to, I don't feel it the same way. The book that prompted me doing this tier ranking, The Stone of Farewell. So this is the second book in Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. And I like the writing, and that's mostly the only thing that I like. I really don't care for this series. And the reason that it prompted this tier ranking is because it's the one I've read the most recently. And I kind of just needed to remind myself how much I love epic fantasy in a sense. I thought, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to think of a bunch of epic fantasy I've read. I just want to see how this compared. I just want to see. And as noted, I like something that was written before, which would be The Arrows of the Queen. But we don't point to Mercedes Lackey. We point to her peers who came after. And it makes me sad. But anyway, so Stone of Farewell, it's one of those books that at the end of the day, epic fantasy does have a lot to offer. And I'm actually kind of glad that it's something I can point to as this one didn't work out for me. Because I think when people think of epic fantasy, they have a very narrow view of what epic fantasy has to offer. And epic fantasy, as I think this list shows, there's so many different aspects to it. It's its own subgenre, but it does a lot within it. And it should, because of the fact that it's epic. Its stakes are epic. Its lore can be epic. The representation of different cultures can be epic. What you do with the characters. There's just so many different things you can do with it. That's why I love the subgenre of fantasy. And I think it's a good thing that a lot of my feelings are so varied across these tiers, because I think that is a representation of the fact that epic fantasy is amazing and can do so many different things. And Stone of Farewell just doesn't do the things that I want. It doesn't have the things I'm looking for in my epic fantasy works quite on the same level as the others. Now to the top tier. Ship of Magic. I already kind of talked about this, so I probably don't need to elaborate. I thought Ship of Magic was phenomenal. I liked the introduction to these characters. I liked the way that this world was described, or, it's part of the realm of the Elderlings, but I liked the way the setting was described. I liked the morality that was questioned across your perspectives. I liked so many of those things. Ah, man, I love Ship of Magic. I thought it was so good. Dragon Mage. I think Dragon Mage is phenomenal. If you want an epic fantasy with a huge emphasis on friendship, the 2 boys in this story, Aram and Marcus, their bond is so lovely and wonderful. And also, I feel like the world is really cool and the writing is great and the lore is cool as well. It's great. I love Dragon Mage and I just need more people to read it because I think it's fantastic. Some Stormlight Archive books do love Way of King. Probably one of, for me, the strongest representations of what you can do with epic fantasy, because I really think Sanderson embraced the idea, not just that he was going to have something epic in scope, that he was going to completely create an entirely new world with interesting cultures and different cultures from one place to the next, a status system that we see the repercussions of, and also very deep character examinations, combining all of those things, and on top of that, a really fascinating magic system. Even if it doesn't work for you, and even if you can't stand it at all, or some of the criticisms about like the writing's not as elegant as the writing in some of these other things, I don't necessarily disagree with that. But when we talk about things being influential or we talk about things being unique, I don't know there are too many others that quite do a lot of the things I described on the level that this does. Even if you don't like it, like the sheer scope of it all and the effort put in, I think at the very least that is admirable. Maybe this will be one of the areas that somebody's like, no, Way of Kings is trash. Maybe that's the one that you'll say you disagree with me on the most. I don't know. I do think Words of Radiance was a great next installment in this, and then I did like that Rhythm of War was somewhat in some ways a return to certain things I liked about the first two, and then in other ways was different in that its setting kind of had this more edge of your seat, closed off feeling that was thriller-esque in a sense. I thought that was really cool. And some of the ways that the antagonists and the protagonists kind of have to work together in that one, or they're understanding each other in different ways. Maybe you're recognizing that what you thought was the antagonist isn't. I thought that the way all of that was done in Rhythm of War was really fascinating and fun to explore. Last, the only series on this list where every installment is at the top, which is why I consistently recommend this series. It's why it's one of my favorite series of all time, and that would be The Winnowing Flame by Jen Williams. I complimented The Age of Uprising, Engines of Chaos, and Engines of Empire for being one of the only ones that had steampunk and epic fantasy mixed. This one is one of the only ones that, it's probably the only thing comparable would be Stormlight Archive, but sci fantasy, sci epic fantasy, I want so much more of it. That is what this series made me realize, is I want so much more sci epic fantasy because it's awesome. It's so cool. Because I can never say too much about the sci-fi elements because they're things that kind of are revealed to you over the course of the series. But it's so cool. And then also you have these creature, animal companion things that you get throughout the course of the series. You also have this interesting lore that the characters are trying to learn. There's this like ticking away feeling where you have the characters like this dread that's just looming, and you know something bad is going to happen, and it has to do with certain characters and the fact that their entire race is deteriorating, or the fact that you know that there's some kind of threat, but you don't know what the threat is. You just know it's coming, and that's why the history is so important. That's why the lore is so important. That's why you want to figure it out before the threat comes and before it's too late. Also, the characters are endearing and irritating at the same time, which I really, really liked. I liked that they weren't just kind of generically good or overly morally gray. I love this series so much. I adore it. I think it's fantastic. I wish more people would read it because it's so good and it's so underhyped in comparison to a lot of what we've talked about today. I think it's phenomenal. If I'm being honest, the second one maybe should be in tier 2. But the only reason I decided not is when I was looking at what was in tier 2, I'm like, I still like the second one in this series probably more than all, if not most, of the books in the second tier. And I was like, well, I'll just go ahead and put it in the top. So I love the series. That's pretty much the conclusion to this. There are some other series that I considered having within this that I don't have because in my mind, maybe they just don't quite meet what I categorize as epic fantasy. For example, like the Daevabad series, I might consider epic fantasy. And then other days, I'm like, is it more just high fantasy? Same goes for something like Mistborn, where I think more high fantasy than I do epic fantasy. And I didn't really feel like getting into hyper categorization or getting into the specifics too much. And I felt like we already had a good batch of books to have in this tier ranking and kind of bounce off of each of the books to have certain conversations. So apologies if I've missed any that I have picked up and just didn't include today. I wasn't trying to snub anything by having it absent. I just thought that these were the ones that really fit epic fantasy in my mind. As I asked at the beginning, which one do you agree with me on the most? Which one do you disagree with me on the most? It's okay if you can't pick a single one. Maybe you have a couple that you're like, I gotta say my thoughts on this. And then if you have any recommendations based off of the things that I enjoyed, or maybe you have some anti-recommendations where if you're like, if you didn't like this, I don't think you'll like this, feel free to let me know. And let me know, what is your favorite epic fantasy of all time? Because I love epic fantasy. I love what it can do. And I think that when it's done well, it's one of the best kinds of storytelling. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.